Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on World War II in fiction. My name is Joanna Burkhardt. I'm the Collection Development Officer at the University of Rhode Island. I'll be moderating this session today. Tales of the many heroes who risked their lives during World War II are always popular. Today, we have the authors of 3 new books about that era. Let's give a warm welcome to David Baerwald, who wrote The Fire Agent.
Hello.
And Lori Inglis Hall, who is the author of The Shock of the Light.
Hello.
And finally, Gabriella Saab, the Star Society author.
Hello. Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time and the opportunity to talk about your new books. So I'll jump right in. Gabriella, I'll start with you. Your book, The Star Society, covers a host of events during and after World War II. Did you have one best source or a number of best sources for your background material?
I did. As you said, it covers a lot of different topics from the war to after the war. So I needed a lot of material, which was fun. I always like to find, parts of history that I don't know a lot about and learn more about them through my novels. So with World War II, we hear a lot about what happened in the United States or the United States involvement in the war or the French involvement or the British. But I personally did not know a lot about what was happening in the Netherlands. And so I got to learn a lot about that mostly through a book called Dutch Girl by Robert Madsen, who wrote basically, it's almost like an autobiography of Audrey Hepburn's life, because she grew up in the Netherlands during the Second World War. And this book was very loosely inspired by her and her life. So that was fascinating. I learned so much. It reads like fiction. It is an incredible book. Um, and then for the post-war part of the story, which is the majority of the novel, that was the Red Scare in Hollywood, which began in 1946, mostly with the entertainment industry. When we think of the Red Scare, we think of the 1950s and kind of when it was at its peak, but it all began mostly in Hollywood with the entertainment industry. And so I learned so much about that through trials and documentaries and transcripts and a few really good novels as well, or not novels, nonfiction, one of which was Show Trial by Thomas Doherty, which was kind of discussing how that came to be, how the Red Scare began in Hollywood, and just kind of that slow progression as it built up to what we recognize today.
Great, thank you. Lori, your story, The Shock of the Light, includes many strong women characters whose activities were secret and unofficial, so to speak. The military/government was unwilling to acknowledge the work of those women at the time. I assume that is not fiction. Did you find official sources that later acknowledged their work?
I did, yeah. So the Shock of the Light, one of the characters is involved in the Special Operations Executive, which was this sort of secretive organization during the Second World War, which sent agents undercover behind the lines in in occupied territories. And I was really lucky because I studied this area at university, and I was lucky in the sense that this coincided with the release of the official files around the Special Operations Executive. There had been an official history, which was published after the war, but most of the agents' files, most of the operational papers remained classified. And there's also this sort of infamous story from the war that lots of the SOE files were destroyed in a mysterious fire. But what happened with this sort of vacuum of information was it provided a really fertile ground for conspiracy theories. And that was really the motivation behind finally releasing the files, opening them up in the early noughties. But there were other ways of accessing this information before that. So, quite a few of the agents were murdered in concentration camps. They were captured, they were executed. So testimony around their fates, the way they were treated, formed part of, for example, the testimony of the Nuremberg trials. So there were other ways of sort of accessing what had happened to these people.
Fascinating. Thank you. David, your grandfather's notes and diaries from Japan, on which your book, The Fire Agent, is based, were passed on to you. Were they actually in microdot format? And what made you look at them when you did? You need to unmute your mic. Great.
Well, first, from what Lori just said, my father went to an SOE training school in Canada, a special office of executive action, the school of mayhem. They learned how to blow things up and kill each other without people noticing. But no microdots, no answers, just stacks and stacks of photographs and intelligence documents and things that I couldn't understand, things that were written in Middle German that I couldn't read, but it was full of clues, and it started me on really what became a detective story that's probably going to continue until I die. I mean, there were things that I knew growing up. I knew that my great-grandfather had been a school teacher, or I was told he was a school teacher in Frankfurt. That was not true. He was actually a famous historian and philosopher who became the director of this extremely mysterious school that was founded by the Rothschild banking family to kind of people the world with bankers. I mean, you hear things growing up, but none of them made any sense. And before the internet, it was impossible to find out what it all was. So part of this process has been piecing together the mystery of who we all are. My family, my sisters, my parents, and me, whose life has been plagued by reflexes that I'm only now beginning to understand. I mean, I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you. That's totally fascinating. Gabriella, in your book, you mentioned that Nazis were recruited to work for the US government after the war. Was this practice widespread? Did you find more about that in your research?
It did. It was widespread in the sense that it was not relegated strictly to the United States. Governments employed this same practice. And basically, the reasoning for it was, the world had just thwarted this threat of fascism. Now they were dealing with communism and the Soviet Union. So the kind of rationalization, if you want to call it that, was basically communism is the larger threat right now. So in order to address that, they would recruit German officers, people who had been Nazis or collaborators, because again, rationalizing this, was the argument was these were the people who weren't violent. They weren't the people in charge of the concentration camps necessarily, or the people who were on the ground at those camps doing all the killing and the torturing. But they were affiliated with the party in some way. Maybe they had a few crimes, maybe some that weren't so extreme, whatever you want to call it. So they would tell them essentially, we'll not persecute you for these and not prosecute you and take you to trial if you will work for the government. And so we had a lot of Germans, many of whom were Nazis, in technology and engineering, involved in the space race, Operation Paperclip. And then there were a lot who were recruited for government intelligence, Cold War, looking for communists, identifying, all those threats and thwarting those. And so I didn't know a lot about it until I kind of read more and used that, as influence on my story as well. But yes, it was a lot more widespread than I initially thought because, it was obviously something that was kept very quiet for obvious reasons.
And that practice certainly appears as a twist in your story.
Yes.
Thank you. Lori, there are lots of stories of resistance in France during World War II. Is yours based on a particular story or is it a composite?
It's a composite. I think, like every author of historical fiction, I have liberally plundered history for my story. But when I was doing my research for the Shock of the Light, I just kept coming across these stories of people in the resistance accomplishing these astounding escapes from the enemy, so astounding they were almost unfathomable. And I kept reading them and thinking, really? Did that really happen? And it sort of made me think about how even, you know, the smallest grain of doubt can cast a shadow over a person's actions. And I also thought a lot about the people who collaborated with the enemy during the war, which also made me wonder, if you had to do something truly awful to save your life, would you? And it was really, really sort of those ideas that I took out of all these areas that I was researching, and that formed the sort of basis for the story.
Wonderful, thank you. David, you inherited this treasure trove of information about your family and the situation in the Far East during World War II. How much of your story is fictionalized and how much is based on the facts of what you inherited?
Well, the initial superstructure of the thing was based entirely on fact. My grandfather had a very intimate experience of actually what Gabriella was just talking about the integration of Nazis into the U.S. U.S., British, Soviet power structures. The stuff that I consider sort of the meat of the book, which is the emotional relationships and the love affairs and the food and the and just this was all completely imagined. And I'm sure it was wishful thinking. I mean, I did make everybody much better looking than reality would justify, but so yes, so the answer is yes and no. The history, the battles, the schools, the Beethoven, the war criminals, all true. The dazzling beauty of my grandmother, entirely fictional. She was actually kind of a troll.
Okay, thank you. Gabriella, you mentioned that one of your characters is loosely based on actress Audrey Hepburn. Were there other actors or actresses who changed their identities during and after the war? Did you find any of that?
None of them that I found really changed their identities as drastically as my characters in my book do, and Audrey Hepburn herself did not either. She took, she has her father's last name. He was actually Hepburn Rustin, and he kind of had a double-barreled name, so she shortened it to Hepburn, and came to the US, but she didn't hide her past. She didn't change who she was, but she also did not talk about it because no one did, but also because she was just a very private person. And so she grew up in the Netherlands. She worked for the resistance. She was a dancer. She danced to raise money to support the resistance efforts. She helped down pilots. She delivered messages and things like that. Suffered a lot of malnutrition, was there through liberation, lived there afterwards, came to the US, I think in the early 50s. So when she got here, I was just very fascinated by what that would be like to go from someone who had endured something like that and had lived with such bravery and didn't really acknowledge that she had done anything spectacular. And then to become someone who is so well known, arguably one of the most famous actresses ever, who was a very private person and just did not really want to talk about herself or her life or be in the spotlight the way she was. So I thought that was really interesting. And how would you reconcile living in that very public way when that's not really who you are as a person? So I kind of took that to the extreme by having my character go from living in the war, living through that, to coming to America, kind of totally reinventing who she is as an actress, as someone in the public who is also extremely private and does not talk about her personal life.
Excellent, thank you very much. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and if we have time at the end, we will try and address some of those questions. Okay, Lori, twins are a big part of your story. How does the device of twinness help to frame and move your story ahead?
Um, so I wanted to explore two parts of the SOE story. So the events on the ground during the occupation of France, which I do through the character of Tessa, one of the twins, and then what happened after liberation, in which France was just this chaotic mess. It was a traumatized country, and in the midst of this, the British were trying to find the personnel they had dropped behind the lines during the occupation. So sort of amid all this chaos, and I do that through the character of Theo, who is the other twin. And I knew right from the beginning that I wanted to explore this through a close relationship, but I just wasn't interested in doing it through a romantic relationship. You know, Tessa is doing all these extraordinary things. She's showing the most incredible bravery, and all the time she's thinking about her boyfriend. I just felt that it sort of detracted from what she was doing, and that's how I sort of came to 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 the idea of looking at this lens of history through twins, through these two characters who see themselves as two sides of the same coin.
Very interesting. Thank you. David, your story reveals a really complex and confusing situation with many shifting alliances and partnerships in the Far East during the war. Did you have other documentation that helped decipher what was happening in the Far East at the end of the Second World War?
In the initial tranche of documents that I found, I mean, again, I was dealing initially with just threads, clues, people having discussions with one another when both of them know what they're talking about and nobody else would, that kind of thing. A lot of letters, a lot of photos, who's this guy, and there's a lot of tracing and detective work had to happen. But in terms of what was going on, I mean, during, I hate to, I'm kind of in a dishonest place here because my book really isn't specifically about World War II. It's more about what happened before and after. But the stuff that happened during the war, I mean, the battles and the like, yes, that's pretty well documented stuff. The internal documents from IG Farben that I had to have translated laboriously, those told me a lot, not so much about what was going on in Asia at the time, but how closely linked German and Japanese industry were, and capital. But in terms of, I mean, people ask me that all the time. Do I have any kind of classified stuff? And I mean, yeah, but not classified now. It's all declassified. So nothing that I have, while, I mean, nothing of what I have or have written about is going to get me killed by Japanese intelligence or anything. It's all very, uh, you know, very well documented history. So when I started, no. When I was done, yeah, I could probably write a college course on it.
Okay, well, it's good to know you're safe. Thank you.
It's not everyone's concern, but I feel it.
Yeah, I guess so. Gabriella, in your story, you also have sisters who are twins. They're both strong women, but their paths have diverged significantly. So how does the twinness in your story move it along?
Much to Lori's point, I wanted to tell this story as closely and as intimately as I could because there are two points of view. There's Ada, who's the actress, and her twin sister is Ingrid, who is a private investigator for the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating communism, and her sister is under suspicion. These two have been separated during the war. They each lose track of each other. They think the worst and then reconnect in this way. And there's a lot of moral complexity that comes from that. And so because they're two people essentially on different sides of this battle, I thought, I could explore this through a close friendship. I could explore it even through a sisterhood, but the way to get them the closest and to have that impact as strong as I possibly could is through them being twins, two sides of the same coin, as Lori said, because then they have the closeness of sisters and the closeness of twins. And so it just really made it fun for me to explore because despite everything, despite all their different paths and their different views, they are first and foremost going to look out for each other and protect each other in whatever way they feel is going to accomplish that best. So that's really what I wanted the heart of the story to be, is about two women who are strong women who have their beliefs and their convictions, but who are 100% loyal to one another.
Okay, thank you. That really comes through in the story.
No, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Laurie, not every story has a happy ending, especially those concerning the Nazi occupation. How did the conclusion of your story honor those who didn't survive?
Yeah, so there were 39 women agents who were dropped into France during the war, and 16 of them didn't come home. The majority of that 16 they were brutalized and executed in concentration camps. I felt extremely wary about presenting that in the novel. I think a writer has a tremendous responsibility when exploring that particular area of history, not to sensationalize, not to embellish anything. The novel is fiction, but this happened to real people. And, at the same time, I knew it was important to acknowledge that many women in SOE had met that end. So it was really important to me to include an author's note with my novel, to give space to the real women that this had happened to. And I hope that anyone who reads it feels compelled to go on and explore the real history behind it, because I think that's actually how we honor those who didn't survive, by, we remember them.
Yes, certainly. It certainly made me want to know more. Thank you. David, you talk about a prison camp. I think it was from World War II, where prisoners were fairly well treated. Where did you find information about that?
Well, it was World War I, actually, to
Yes.
add to the complexity of it. Um, well, there's a museum there now. Also, my grandfather kept a diary there, and also I have a photo book that he took. He was an avid photographer, and yeah, it's a famous circumstance. It was where Beethoven's Ninth was debuted in Japan. It was the first performance of Beethoven's Ninth was in this prison. Um, and they toured Japan as prisoners, as an orchestra. Um, I found musical reviews in the Asahi Shimbun, the big Japanese newspaper, um, of their, a review of their performance. The one of the members of the royal family at the time was a guy named Tokugawa, Marquis Tokugawa, and he was an avid music fan, and he wrote a column, and so he wrote quite a bit about Bondo, about this prison camp, and actually, the prison camp was one of the things that made me have a lot of the questions that I had because, that they were treated so kindly and so respectfully and so magically, really. And only 17 years later, the Japanese military had really quite literally gone insane. Uh, in 1937, there was what the incident known as the Rape of Nanking, which is one of the most savage events. And it's so hard to put those two things together, the incredible treatment of my grandfather and his colleagues and the incredible savagery that was to be unleashed. And so, that was a fascinating question for me through this whole thing, which I think I've sort of largely solved in my mind. But I don't solve it in the book, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I was learning.
Not every mystery needs to be solved. Thank
Yeah.
you. Gabriella, did you visit Holland or any of the other places of note in your story?
I did not visit Holland. I wanted to so badly, but luckily my best friend from college has since moved to a town that is right outside where I needed my research. And so her partner is Dutch, and so he was a huge help in telling me about the culture and the language and the places that I wasn't able to visit. But I did go to Hollywood, which was fantastic. I'd never been to LA. But I went out west and I went to the Biltmore Hotel, which features in the story. That's where the House Un-American Activities Committee conducted very early hearings before moving them to Washington, D.C. I went to a studio tour of Warner Brothers. So I did the old Hollywood tour. So I learned all about Hollywood at this time in the 30s and the 40s. And I saw where Audrey Hepburn filmed My Fair Lady. So I was just absolutely in heaven. It was fantastic. And I went to, all the famous old bars and restaurants, Musso and Frank and the Frolic Room and all up and down the Walk of Fame. And it was just amazing. I had so much fun. I tend to prefer like East Coast New York City. So I thought, I'm not really, I mean, it'll be fine. It'll be interesting, but I really did love it. I loved it a lot. It was great.
Excellent, thank you. Lori, pretty much the same question. Did you visit some of your places in France or other places in your story?
Yeah, I think I've been to every location in the novel except Nuremberg. I never made it to Nuremberg, but Tessa and Theo's house in Cambridge, where they grow up, is based on a house that I spied years and years ago when I was hunting on the River Cam. I kind of floated past this really beautiful house, not realizing that years later I'd be writing about it in a novel. Um, I used to live in the part of London where Theo lives in later life. My university library was around the corner from Aunt Violet's house where Tessa lives during the war. I got to go and have lunch at the Special Forces Club, which is this club for ex-spies in London, which is just as cool as it sounds. And I know Paris pretty well. So yeah, I just borrowed from my own life and then kind of went off and did research wherever I could for the other places across Europe.
Excellent, thank you. David, do you still have ties to Tokyo, Japan, and the Far East? And have you visited? You're obviously from there.
Well, yeah, it's Japan is as much a part of me as the guitar, or yeah, we have a fellowship that we founded at UCLA in my father's name, um, for Japanese scholars. I have many, many Japanese friends. I mean, Japan is in many ways for me. I mean, I long for it every day. Uh, um, and yeah, it's as much a part of me as my fingernails. Um, that'll never change. My family goes back there to the early 1900s, and um, my cousins are from there. My sister was born there. It was a big part of our lives. So yeah, I was pretty familiar with the terrain. Of course, you don't see anything when you're a kid. You don't really understand what you're seeing. And later on, you go, "Oh God, that was an NSA surveillance suite." The school that I went to was a hub of espionage. And the campus, the college campus that we grew up on, was also a hub of Japan at the time when I was a boy was the biggest U.S. intelligence station in the world. It was bigger than Berlin, which everybody usually thinks of. But no, no. NSA, huge that was kind of where the NSA was really given its first wings, as it were. It's where the U-2 spy plane flew from. So, it's anyway, yeah, to the short answer, yeah.
Well, it certainly informed your story. It made it very, very real.
I'm very glad.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I do want to
Well,
thank
that's disappointing.
all our participants for your time and your efforts, and I encourage everyone to read these 3 books. They are just wonderful.
I know what I'm reading next.